So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rebecca Sero.
Thank you so much, Becca. I appreciate it. Debra and I are very excited to be here. We are former colleagues. I used to work at Washington State University for many years, and I am an evaluation specialist at heart. So even though I am doing a variety of methodology now at my current position, ripple effects mapping and qualitative data collection is truly where my heart lies. And so I'm so excited to be here to speak with you all about this tool. We're going to go through our process. We're giving you kind of, I guess, a flavor of what ripple effects mapping is. And in order to learn how to do it, there's certainly more involvement, but this is just an example so that you can kind of see an overall assumption of the different things that we do and can do with ripple effects mapping. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Debra as soon as I get the slide shared, and we're going to go ahead and get ourselves started. I will say, as we're going through, please feel free to raise your hand, to take yourself off mute, or to drop things in the chat. We're always happy to stop and answer questions as we go along if there's something that's not clear or you'd like some additional information about it. So with that, let me go ahead and get my screen shared.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll fill in a little bit here. So Rebecca is an evaluation specialist, and I am not. My background, first career was in graphic design, and then I became an adult educator with Extension. And I love the facilitation part of this work. So we're a great team because I love the community engagement, getting those stories out of people's heads and onto the paper, but not the evaluation piece. So our question that we often ask when we train this is, do you ever feel like this after evaluation personally? I know that when I fill out surveys, I usually do them because I feel obligated. I ask people to do evaluation all the time. So if somebody asks me, I always fill it in. Ripple effects mapping often elicits this kind of reaction from the participants that are doing the work. So that's why we like it. The reason that we do ripple effects mapping is because there's challenges to the kind of work that we do. What Brandeis does in your Heller Institute or Heller community is messy, long-term, long game work, right? It's trying to help people learn very complex issues and ideas and make changes in their lives. And the impact of your work may not be evident for a long time. So these kids were taught gardening, but we don't know what they're going to do with that gardening class. Will they become soil scientists? Will they become future foodies? Will they just like putting their fingers in the dirt? We don't know what that is. And ripple effects mapping helps us find out those outcomes at a later date. So the questions that we ask us in our programming, even my real job, what I do when I'm not doing ripple effects mapping, are we making a difference? Do funders want to know how much of a difference are we making and what kinds of ways are we doing this? Ripple effects mapping really is a tool where you can unpack and discover some of these amazing stories that people have in their heads. So we're going to talk you and walk you through the process here. Rebecca, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Debra. So at the heart of it, ripple effects mapping is a participatory evaluation tool. And it's participatory at multiple pieces and aspects of the tool as you walk through it. And the reason that participatory evaluation is so important to me personally is that I believe that if we're asking people to provide us with information and data and things that we're going to use, I want to make sure that I'm engaging with them at each and every level of the process. If I create a survey or if I develop focus group questions, I'm doing that as an evaluator, and I could be working with the team to ensure that those questions are what we want and that we're going to end up with the kind of data we want at the end. What ripple effects mapping allows us to do, though, is to engage with participants from the very beginning. We work with community members and others that are part of the team to develop the questions, to decide who's going to be in the room, to determine when it's best to have the ripple effects mapping. Obviously, during the actual mapping itself, although you don't know how it works, you can kind of start to see we're actually asking people to tell us their stories. And so they're participating and participatory during the actual data collection process. And then at the end of that data collection, we're asking questions like, what's the most significant change? What is most valued by you or by your community? When we're going through the actual data analysis portion, oftentimes that's a solo event, right? I'm working myself, I'm doing data analysis. I might be working with a coder along with me that we're trying to justify our coding and stuff, but we very seldom involve the participants in the analysis. Ripple effects mapping allows us to do it. We go in and we do member checks. We help to ask whether the types of codes and the type of information we're receiving is accurate and reflective of the work. And then when it comes to reporting, we work with the participants to understand how best can this data be presented? What is it that you want to do with it? How do you want to use it? So you can see from the very start to the very end, we find ways to ensure that those who are helping us, that we're also helping them, that we're ensuring that they're involved in each and every step. One of the great things about ripple effects mapping is that it helps us to understand both the intended and unintended outcomes of our work. When I'm developing questions, one of the things I'm often doing is trying to ensure that the types of questions I'm developing, again, whether those are for a survey or for a focus group, that those questions are going to get me the data I need at the end. I have a very intended amount of information that I'm intending to, that I'm assuming I'm going to get based on those types of questions, whether they're open-ended or close-ended. There's kind of an idea. I'm pretty much sure what type of information I'm going to do and going to be able to receive at the end of my evaluation. What ripple effects mapping allows us to do is we use a certain type of question, an appreciative inquiry focused set of questions that allow us to get at things that we don't necessarily knew we were going to get. That's the unintended aspect. When you think about dropping that rock in the pond, the ripples that come out, as community workers, as people who do work in nonprofit or community-based areas, we often can kind of have assumptions about what those ripples will look like, but sometimes those ripples go in directions that we don't know. And if we don't know, we don't know to ask. And so appreciative inquiry questions that we develop through ripple effects mapping kind of gets us at the types of things that we weren't sure we necessarily were going to get. And so we didn't know to ask it, but because the questions are broad and focused in a certain way, those unintended outcomes will often come out. And we find that to be very useful when we're trying to best understand what impact, what outcomes came about as a result of this program, this project, this engagement, whatever it may be.
Rebecca, you got muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I'm a type of person that I like to kind of understand what the process is going to look like. So today we're going to show you a ripple effects mapping event video where we recorded a mapping that occurred in person, so you can kind of see it as it unfolded. We're going to talk through sort of some of the benefits and core components of what makes up ripple effects mapping. We'll briefly cover some steps of how we put it together. And then we have some examples for you to kind of understand what would you be able to do with this type of data, with this type of work. And then we have some room at the end, some time saved for some questions and comments. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start this video. Like I mentioned, this is a video of a ripple effects mapping that occurred pre-pandemic, when we were all used to get into rooms together and be able to chat at leisure. This is part of something called the Peninsula Food Coalition. This food coalition was looking to understand the work that had happened as a result of the coalition coming together and looking to help improve food outcomes in a community in Western Washington State.
I can see some of them are like this. Oh, let me talk. I want to make sure that everybody in the front row gets this. She's front row too. She's Hold up another chair.
Ripple mapping is about telling stories Telling stories is a really powerful way for people to relate their experience, for others to jump in and understand that experience.
Because of the relationship with the Peninsula Food Coalition, I started doing some initial recipe demos at the Port Angeles and Squim Food Bank.
Because it's participatory, because it's creative, because it's visual, allows people to come together and really tease out the far-reaching positive benefits that their work has had in a community. Ripple mapping starts out where the facilitator asks the participants to engage in some appreciative inquiry, to pair off in groups or pairs, to ask a series of questions that get people in the storytelling mode. And from there, they come back together and the facilitator starts to ask people to tell those stories, asking prompts that say, so what about that? What's the impact of that? And all the while mapping it out on a large scale so that everyone can see it and participate and jump in and add and build on. After this participatory component, that huge map is taken and coded. The stories that we're told are organized into different frameworks that trace impacts from their beginning to their end, where you're measuring what are the social impacts of this work, what are the financial impacts of this work, where in the community are they having an effect.
This is the moment when I go, ah, maybe it won't work this time. It feels like stepping off a cliff. I mean, we have this big, huge, big piece of white paper up here, stories in your brain, and now we're going to try to make sense of it.
Debra Hansen and Rebecca Sero with WSU Extension and Lori Higgins with the University of Idaho have taken the ripple mapping technique and refined it and actually developed a manual that takes groups from start to finish through this process. The beauty of ripple mapping is that you can use it at all scales. You can use it as simply a participatory team building effort where people are taking a pause in their work and looking back at what have we accomplished so far and what are the impacts. Or you can take it all the way through the sort of data coding aspects of it to really get a sense of where the impacts are clustered. The Peninsula Food Coalition started about 3 years ago with two very forward-thinking directors of our two biggest food banks in Clown County, the Port Angeles Food Bank and the Squim Food Bank, bringing a group of people together to really talk about how we can interface and collaborate in our food assistance work.
Northwest Harvest started Growing Connections so that we could help our partner food banks get more fresh produce to their clients. That is the goal of the program. And our first Growing Connections meeting was a result of the connection, obviously with our partner programs, but also with the two Rotary First Harvest Vista, because we were cohort members and there was already a lot of work on the ground.
The work of the coalition includes gleaning, it includes farm to food bank purchases, it includes processing the abundance of food that's coming in through that gleaning program. It includes troubleshooting the transportation and distribution aspects of it. It includes networking with local tribes to ensure that healthy food is getting to the farthest reaches of our county.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop it there because the rest of it goes on to talk about the work that the Peninsula Food Coalition is doing. If that's something you're interested in hearing about, because that's work that you also may be doing, you can find this video on YouTube. If you type in Ripple Effects Mapping Peninsula Food Coalition, you can watch it all the way to the end. But one of my favorite parts of this is not just how well edited it is, which it is, and certainly our WSU colleague had such lovely things, Clea had such lovely things to say about ripple effects mapping, which is always fun to hear from someone else. But it was that aha there at the end where one of the participants had made a comment and the person next to her was like, we often find that happening with ripple effects mapping. When we're doing the work in communities, we often don't necessarily we kind of get into our own silos, right? We don't necessarily understand or see the bigger picture or what's happening or how our work has influenced someone else. And what ripple effects mapping does is it brings everyone in the room at the same time, whether that's an in-person room or a virtual room, because we do it both ways. And it allows people to kind of better understand the processes that have been occurring, even if they haven't been a part of it or they're just somewhat a part of it. And it gives people a bigger picture in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have. So let's keep going and talk through a little bit about what some of the participant and evaluator benefits are for ripple effects mapping. As I mentioned, as an evaluator, I always want to make sure that those people that are helping to provide me data are also getting some benefit out of it, that I'm not just taking, that there's also this reciprocity that exists. And ripple effects mapping is one way that I'm able to have reciprocity with the participants of the data collection process. So when someone goes through ripple effects mapping, what we often find is that the group or the coalition or the community, whatever it happens to be, they're able to see emerging patterns and trends that they weren't necessarily aware of. It uncovers work that has happened over a span of time. And the result of that is that people often are very positive and hopeful when seeing results. That first slide that we showed where there were two people that were high-fiving, that was not a scripted moment. We did not set that up, although I'm so glad that someone had their camera out and captured it. But it was truly that emphatic where those women went to the front of the room and were looking through all the work that their community had accomplished, and they high-fived each other as a result. And that's kind of, that's a bit goosebump inducing to realize that people are actually seeing their results and understanding the impact that they're having. We find that ripple effects mapping often allows community organizations or coalitions to kind of connect to a larger purpose. I mentioned that idea of how we're often siloed in the work we're doing, and we don't necessarily understand how our little piece of the pie fits into the bigger whole. Ripple effects mapping kind of allows people to step back and see that big picture. It also allows for some reflection and growth. Sometimes we don't necessarily see or think through what direction are we heading in? Are we doing the work we should be doing? And ripple effects mapping kind of gives you a chance to take a step back, to look at what's been accomplished, and to think through, are we moving in the direction that we want to be moving in? Are we doing the kinds of things we want to be doing? And kind of there at the bottom, it's fun, it's engaging, and it's a very visual method. Especially when you're in person, we have a giant butcher block, as you saw, butcher block paper, as you saw on the front of the wall, and people are telling their stories to the facilitator. In this case, that's Debra, who's standing at the top of the room using different colors and writing it out. And when people can see their work showing up on the wall, that's meaningful to them as well as to others. And there are times when people use ripple effects mapping just for this team building exercise. I'm in it for the data, right? Like that's the part that I find most exciting. But sometimes there are community coalitions or community organizations that just want to kind of reinvigorate the work that their members and the work that they've been doing, and they can use ripple effects mapping to do that. Of course, as an evaluator, I also want some benefits, right? Like I'm not doing this just because I want to help others. I also want to be able to get something out of it. And so full disclosure, right? I'm excited to say that ripple effects mapping kind of allows me to collect a variety of stories and level of impacts from community members, from coalition members, from those participants who have been invited to be in the room. It captures chains of events that are from complex or evolving work. A lot of the work we do, it doesn't necessarily have an exact start and an exact end point. It's multi-year, it's ongoing, it is sometimes ever changing. And ripple effects mapping helps us to figure out how do we capture pieces of that work to tell a meaningful story. It can be done at a variety of times during the actual program or during the process. We have used it for process evaluation. You've done it for a mid-program or for a summative evaluation at the end. So when something has come to an end, it'll be maybe 6 months, a year and a half, 2 years later, we'll come back and we'll do a ripple effects mapping to understand the impact that that work has had. It also provides a group validation of results. When I am doing any kind of evaluation, I'm looking to kind of do member checks, to do triangulation, to ensure that the data I'm collecting is accurate and reflective and valid. And so there are times when we have been in ripple effects mapping and someone says something and there's someone else that speaks up and says, actually, it didn't quite happen like that. It was closer to this, that, and the other. So that idea that everyone's in the room at the same time expressing what's happening allows people to kind of check themselves and to be like, oh yeah, that's right. This is the way that process went. And then finally, it really kind of allows for this when outcomes are difficult to conceptualize or measure. Ripple effects mapping and its appreciative inquiry open-ended approach helps us to kind of wrap our arms around that and to figure that out much easier. And we'll talk through in just a minute about the different ways in which you can kind of code the data, especially when it comes to these difficult and messy types of work that sometimes we're doing. So just a brief synopsis of places that it's worked. On the side of your screen, you can see something called a Field Guide to Ripple Effects Mapping. That's a book that was edited by Scott Chasden from the University of Minnesota, Mary Emery, who was at South Dakota State University, Debra at Washington State, Lori Higgins at Idaho, and myself. And we put together a step-by-step process of what makes ripple effects mapping work and where are different examples of how it's worked around both the United States and internationally. And so we have actually used ripple effects mapping with a variety of topic areas and a variety of participants, leadership development, business development, volunteer programs, people who are trying to understand what their volunteers have done and how to kind of get their volunteers re-engaged. Master Gardeners is an extension program that goes into the community and wants to help people improve their gardening abilities. Food systems, we obviously just saw the Food Coalition. That's been one that's been especially relevant lately, as well as prevention programming is something else we've used it quite a bit with recently. Farm management, 4-H youth, ripple effects mapping has been used with youth as young as 7 and as old as people who are no longer disclosing their age. And then we've done quite a bit with tribal programming. What we have found with doing evaluations with tribes and tribal members is that the storytelling technique is something that that really resonates with that group. And so we've had a lot of luck working with tribal members to tell their stories about different ways in which programming has impacted their tribe and their community. So we wanted to briefly mention kind of, we're saying that it works, but why? Like, how do we know why? What makes it work? What's the recipe behind this lovely little qualitative data technique that we're using? It has 4 primary components: appreciative inquiry, that participatory approach that I've talked a little bit about, the idea of both group interviewing and reflection, and then kind of this radiant thinking. So I'm going to briefly go through those 4 different core components so you can kind of see how they meld together to create this tool that we've been using. So we're gathering data through appreciative inquiry, and the idea is we ask questions like, when thinking about your work, what has made you the proudest? Or what changes have occurred as a result of your work or the result of your community program? Overall, the idea behind appreciative inquiry is that we create positively framed questions because we find that people go in the direction in which they've been asked to go in. And so if you ask very negative questions, people are going to come up with negative things that happened. If, however, you frame questions in a positive manner, it allows people to think through, what are the good things that have happened? How can we talk through what's different now than what happened as a result of before? And this becomes our general focus for our small group interviews. Ripple effects mapping is kind of broken into 2 main parts. We don't just throw people in a room and expect them to just be able to tell their stories. Instead, we have them, as was mentioned during the video, get together in small groups first with 1 or 2 other people to kind of talk through each of these questions, and they interview each other. So they're encouraged. We usually have about 5 or 6 questions for people to choose from. And we've designed those questions, as I mentioned previously, in a participatory manner. So we've designed those questions with the team that we're working with the community that we're working with, to ensure that it's getting at the type of information that they truly want to understand. People will come in with different goals as part of their ripple effects mapping. Some people really want to understand a particular part of their program. Others want to understand all parts of their program, or they might be focused on grants or youth or whatever it happens to be. And we're able to ensure that those questions, while open-ended, are also focused on the areas that they're looking to understand. Then the second core component that helps things work is that we get people back together in either the large room, as you saw in the video, or in a virtual room. So we have an example now of how this virtual mapping works when we had the opportunity. So setting this video up, you can see there in the center of the screen is Motor City's National Heritage Area. There was a group that came to us during the pandemic, and you'll see a reference to masking, and so that should sound familiar to everyone. We had the group come to us, and they really wanted to understand the work that had come about as a result of this national heritage area that was put together in the Michigan area. Based in the Motor Cities, the history of the Motor Cities is very rich and involved with having the first cars that came about out of there. And so they wanted to they had taken it upon themselves to set up this heritage area so that people understood the history of Detroit and the Motor Cities and everything that had come about. And so we got a group together, and one of the advantages of doing it this way was that this group happened not only during the pandemic when we weren't allowed to get together in person, but the group was also geographically dispersed. There were people in Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and they were all able to still come together at the same time to talk through the ways in which the heritage area had made changes in their group and their community.
Okay, thank you, John, and thanks. Nice to meet everybody else. Nice to see everybody unmasked. This is good. Well, I think the thing that I'm most proud of is the Motor Cities Lansing group itself, and the ongoing activities of that group as it's moved forward. I'm the beneficiary of an activity that was conjured up through people involved with that. And that was the Local 602, UAW Local 602 Oral History Project, which involved, John can speak more about this, about the generation of it. But there's a treasure trove of interviews of workers and managers and neighborhood people who were related to the Oldsmobile plant that closed here in Lansing after 72 years, I think it was, of service in making cars into the community. And somebody had the bright idea of interviewing the people who worked there and who managed it and who also lived in the neighborhood about their relationship to each other and to the plant and to the city of Lansing and so forth. And as part of Motor Cities activities and the local groups activities, there was the interviews were deposited at the Michigan State University Library. They were organized by Kevin Baird, and I think John also had a hand in that as well, and a couple of other people from the Michigan Oral History Association. And I stumbled upon these things and just became addicted to listening to them, and realized that there were no photographs. I'm a photographer. I teach photography at Michigan State University. And I contacted John. I said, hey, there's no pictures. Where are the photographs of the people who did these interviews? And John said, well, why don't you take some? John, you can never ask John a question without getting a good job out of it. And he gave me a great job. And so John connected me with other people, Kevin and so forth, and Bill Reed of UAW Local 602, president. And I set up a little photo studio in the local in the Union Hall, also at Michigan State, and I made portraits of the people. And the original intention was just simply to put them in the library with the oral histories. But what I did after that was working with the interviewers and with Kevin and John, edited significant portions of those interviews to synthesize a story that was unique to that person, but also related to everybody, lots of other people as well. So the first day at work, for example, is a classic, and others. The first woman pipe fitter, and others, and more ordinary things, the retirement day, or the people that lived in the neighborhood. And I edited together the fragment from the oral history with the photographs, put them together as a display that I got a grant of support from Michigan State University to finalize. And it is now a portable display with a giant TV screen that can be taken to local 602, it can be taken to high schools, it can be taken to anywhere through the R.E. Olds Museum, which is where it's housed. It's part of the permanent collection down there. And so that's, in a nutshell, I don't know if I've described it sufficiently for you, but there are 42 portraits and 42 stories that someone can scroll through, or someone can just sit there and watch them all and bring some popcorn and listen to people tell their stories about local 602, the Oldsmobile plant. And,
before you run, Peter, talk about how that influenced your work in South Africa, because I think that
right.
from their mapping point of view, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. Well.
All right, so we could certainly go on, but we just wanted to do a short snippet there of an example of how someone was able to kind of tell their story about, in this case, creating a video library that didn't exist prior, that has then been able to be used with a variety of audiences around the state and the region. So as I said, you could see in the video prior how we collect the stories by mapping them and writing them physically on the wall. In a video room, we rely on technology quite a bit, and we make use of something called XMind mapping. And we have someone who is, you didn't have the chance to kind of see the beginning and the end, but we have a moderator or a facilitator, sorry, that's asking the questions, and then we have someone else who's actually typing in the background so that we're able to capture the information that's being shared. And although it isn't quite as fun as being able to see it in different colors on the wall, people are able to see it if they were able to join by computer and see it unfolding in front of them on their screens. And so once we've had the opportunity to gather and map all of the stories from those who are in the room at the time, then we have a large map, and we could do a variety of different things with it. On the day we often ask people, like I said prior, at the beginning of this presentation, how we'll ask people maybe to speak to what has been the most meaningful, the most significant change, what's been the most valuable, different ways in which to kind of understand and even refine the outcomes and the findings a little bit more. When we're doing this map at the end, it becomes so large that you can't read it. And so we'll often take kind of snippets of it to share in reports. And Debra is going to talk about that in just a little bit.
Okay.
So once we've done all of that and we've collected the data, we've engaged with the community to ensure that we've collected the kind of data that they're looking to understand, the next part of the process is the part that I find most interesting. And this is when we're coding the data. With ripple effects mapping, at its heart, it's a qualitative data tool, a qualitative data technique. And so you have qualitative data that you're able to analyze and do a variety of things with it. We find that we often have kind of 3 different types of qualitative data that techniques that we follow. We'll either come in and do some deductive coding where we have a framework in mind. This is something that the organization, or especially lately, we've been working, like I said, a lot with prevention specialists, and they often have specific frameworks that they are tasked with understanding the work that they're doing in the health arena. And so we'll take those frameworks, and that's how we develop our coding. There's other times though, when we do inductive coding, where it's kind of ground up, right? Like they don't have necessarily a specific framework in mind. We don't necessarily know the direction in which the data is going to take us. And so instead we read and code the data to the framework that, or I'm sorry, to the codes that make the most sense based on what the data is telling us. And then there are times when we kind of blend those two together, right? We might start with a framework. So we start with the deductive coding, and then we blend in different types of inductive coding processes as we go along, whether that's hierarchical coding or whatever it may be. You can see up in front of your screen, this is just a small example of if you were to collect some stories and you wanted to put it into an Excel file and sort of break down, this is what Excel would be able to show you as far as different types of codes that these stories fell within. And in this case, we were using the community capitals, which are 7 different capitals that are used to sometimes understand what makes a community successful. And sorry, I have a cat who is joining our meeting today. What makes a community successful and the different things in which what it focuses on. And so in this case, we collected stories through the ripple effects mapping, and then we were taking those stories and slotting them into the different capitals. So when people were talking about being provided a wide variety of opportunities, that would be both a social and a cultural as well as the human type of capital. So the idea really is that you can take this data and you can slice it and dice it in such a wide variety of ways that I could spend hours talking about. But we just wanted to kind of give you a general sense that this qualitative data is very flexible and can be used and understood multiple different ways. So with that, once you code all the data and do all that work, the next part is reporting. And so I'm going to hand the floor over to Debra so that she can talk through all the different ways in which we've taken the time to kind of specify and make very useful reports for the groups that we're working with. Debra?
Thank you, Rebecca. I will tell you that I'm an old graphic designer, so I love this part of it, where we get to see visually how the data works and how the people have told stories. But I want to take a moment to answer the question about the logic model that was asked. It was asked if you put, instead of starting with a blank piece of paper, if you put logic model components and map to that. In the field guide that you can download for free on a PDF, or you can purchase for $10, we don't get a cut of that, so it's just the cost to print. It has case studies in there that talk about different ways to use ripple effects mapping. And there's one method that's in there that is very similar to what you're thinking on the logic model. We do not use that. We start with a blank piece of paper because we want the audience members and the participants to uncover their stories without us leading towards anything specific. We could use the logic model for developing the appreciative inquiry questions or the prompts that help you draw those stories out. But if you put something on a piece of paper, this is what my experience, if you put something on a piece of paper, people will tell a story towards that instead of what's naturally going to come out of their heart that you don't know what is in there. So we don't use that method. And Rebecca, you may comment on that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to add that what I have done in the past is, as Debra said, we're not looking to bias the responses at all. And so we are very clear where we start with just the center of the map, the program, the coalition, the community, whatever it may be. But I have used the logic model components to code the data. So if I'm looking to kind of understand the short, medium, and long-term outcomes that were anticipated from this report, or I'm sorry, from this work, then I have created codes around that and then coded the data. But we certainly, as we mentioned, don't start with it. Go ahead, Debra.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Okay, so whether you're doing a live event or you're doing it online, we put everything into this software called XMind and create these digital maps. And what's nice about that software is you can take a huge map that is a huge community and bring it down into components. So I have 2 examples here from one county where we took all of the 4-H robotics outcomes and put it onto a map so we could go to the teachers and the school districts and the stakeholders around 4-H, specifically with the outcomes. And then in the same community, we had people talking about economics. And so we have the Marine Resources Committee and all of the outcomes of that. So again, like Rebecca said, you have this data that is in this format that you can decide how to present it. What happens magically on the back with the coding and the analysis is Rebecca's game. And I'm always amazed when it comes out with something great, because I don't get engaged in that. I take this part and start making it useful for communities and stakeholders. So out of this economic type of work, I've used it to create a one-page infographic that says, we started with this kind of investment in our county. We added the WSU investment. These are the grants that we wrote, and these are the outcomes of the grants. All of these kinds of stories come out of ripple effects mapping that gives us the way to say, boy, we didn't know that that grant was attached to our work. So we need to collect that data and put it into some more information. Community members will tell you these things, or people as part of your groups will tell you these things. And then you as an evaluator have these aha moments like, boy, I better get more information on that and put it together. So visually, you can use the data for storytelling as we go forward. Also, I wanted to show you the map itself can become a visual piece. This is a map where we embedded quotes from the participants and pictures from their events. And if Rebecca could go to the next slide, it shows the detail of this. If I walked up to a big map and it just had text on it, I'm going to get a little bit lost. But if I look and see, oh, I know those people in that photograph, and oh, they talked about how this program has built relationships and community. And then all of a sudden I'm drawn into the data and the story that's on the map. And I've used this kind of tool at kind of public meetings or galas where people can see their stories on the wall, see the outcomes of their work, show their family members, other stakeholders, you know, gathering up around the map.
And Debra, can you mention how you print it out also? Because you
yes.
print this out sometimes.
Yes, I do. So I have a large format printer because I want to be able to do a big, huge poster of it. And so I can print it up as wide as 36 inches and as long as I want. And so it depends on the how I'm going to use it is how big I would make it. But we have also used these in grant reports, like this little snippet we've included into a grant report so that people can see, oh, that made a difference in the kind of money that we funded. So again, it's pulling those stories out of the collection and figuring out how it's going to best be used for what you need it for. Another way that I used it at a gala was telling the story of the ripples that people have talked about on developing this Cool Pup trailer. And as I'm telling the story, the ripples are popping out behind me on the PowerPoint. And I'm talking with enthusiasm about all the ways that this changed our distribution and helped our farmers and became a food hub. And I'm saying all these details as these ripples are popping out on this PowerPoint. And people are seeing and engaging in the stories that they can then also go up to the map on the wall and look at. But after we did it this way, and I told the stories of the ripples, donors in the room raised $14,000 in 10 minutes to do two more Cool Pup trailers. So they got engaged in the story and the outcomes much more than if I just showed a picture of this and said, this is a really cool thing, we want to build more. So again, how do you use the data and the storytelling aspects of it for the work that you want to do? So here's a group. This is the group that I ripple mapped for the Cool Pup trailers. And here they are after an event showing checks that they all got from an organization. And one of the quotes out of the ripple maps was, we used to be afraid of each other and now we aren't. So we're in a room working together, but hearing all those stories together of outcomes is what brought them together in a shared purpose for the kind of work that they're doing. Another group that I ripple mapped was 3 arts groups in a community that were trying to build a coalition, but feeling kind of siloed and proprietary about their outcomes and their participants. And when we got this big wall together of all the outcomes that they have done together in their own little silos, that reflection piece that Rebecca talked about, they determined that they wanted to do an arts coalition to increase tourism, which is a building of economy, and enhance the livability for people that are already here. And they could see that on the map by the kinds of people they engaged in their arts groups and what the outcomes were. So again, it's them looking at the map hearing the stories and coming out with this kind of mission statement for their arts district. So this is how this all works in a group when you have kind of this enthusiasm going on. And now we'd like to play an audio of a participant that took ripple effects mapping training from us in a different organization and how he used it with coalition building. And so this is a tool that I feel, it looks complicated. It is complicated. There's lots of components, but it's really accessible in getting groups together to do this kind of work. So let's hear from Scott about how he used ripple effects mapping.
And I'm not sure exactly what's going on with my video. There it goes, start my video. So just a couple things that I wanted to share. And first off, thanks for the opportunity to come in and talk about this. I am fairly close to evangelical about this. I love this process because it actually involves engaging people where they love to live, which is talking about what's going on in their communities, what's important to them, what they're proud of. And folks don't like to brag, but they'll tell stories. And from those stories, you can gain all sorts of insight. So as Debra said, I took this particular training in September 2021, I think, something like that, and became really intrigued. My background is in community coalition work, and I'm retired now, but that's where I spent most of my life, either directly coordinating coalitions or providing technical assistance to coalitions. And the thing that constantly bothered me about coalition work was not being able to have an effective way to talk about what's going on between coalition members and what it is that makes them actually have the passion to move forward. It's just a critical ingredient in coalition work, but it's so hard to quantify and so hard to qualify. So that was kind of my, I don't know, curiosity about this was, could we build this into a way to do that? We worked with Northwest PTTC to develop basically a pilot to demonstrate whether we could do that. And we worked with 3 different coalitions. This was in 21, 22. We worked with 3 different coalitions. And I'm just going to tell you a couple of different experiences that happened from those that I found just eye-opening. One was a small community that was doing a positive social norms campaign, and their concern was, is this message actually being received by the community? Is it getting out there? I mean, that's the whole point, right? And we set up a ripple effects mapping event with them. We actually used the science of the positive model to map the ripple effects results. And we were able to show that, yes, they were getting penetration of their message into their community without having to stand outside the Safeway store and do intercept surveys. We were able to show that people were actually taking this information and using it, which is the much more important piece of information. Another coalition that we worked with also wanted to know about their media stuff, and we did that. We asked a lot of questions about their media. We got a lot of information, but what really came up in the ripple effects event was the unanticipated results. What these people were talking about was not their media. I mean, they were proud of that, sure, and they had some impacts, and we could show that. What they were proud of and what they told stories about and just gloated about was the effectiveness of this coalition and how it was just so entwined in their community. And we were actually able to use, in addition to science of positive mapping, to talk about the effects of their media, we're actually able to use another PTTC product called 6 Elements of Effective Coalitions to map the effectiveness of their coalition. When we presented that back to them, they were almost embarrassed to find out how well they did. It was that kind of result for them, but at the same time, there was such an expression of pride from this group for having survived. This coalition has been in business for 18 years. That's a long time for a community organization. And they did it because of these strong ties and the ability to bring people on and have a diverse coalition that's representative of their communities. That's just a couple of stories that we've experienced in our work. What I'm here to tell you is probably the central message is this is doable. This works, and it's relatively easy and intuitive to do. It's kind of scary at first, won't lie. Doing your first mapping of an actual event is kind of scary, but it's amazing how quickly you just fall into it and it just becomes something that you do. So I don't have much more to share other than, again, I'm evangelical. You could probably pick that up, but I also hear this, I also see this as a potential for showing coalition work in a way that coalition work hasn't been shown before, so that it can be appreciated for the real power that it has. Thank you.
Well, I love Scott. He's, like you said, he's evangelical, but I don't know that we've mentioned our belief that ripple effects mapping is a tool of evaluation, but it's not the only tool to use, right? All of the other things that are in your toolbox for evaluating programs and communities. We had a question here about participatory action research, and I'm going to see if Rebecca has a thought about that. But it might be a tool that you use in conjunction with other things as you're looking to evaluate your program, because it's not the only way and the best way in some instances to use the method. So we want to make sure that we share that. I will comment on the logic model. If the community did put together the logic model and they are part of that process, then you might be able to use it already onto your map. Like I said, you might pull up the field guide and look how other people have done that, so that you have a method of getting there or using that tool. People have adopted and adapted ripple effects mapping in many ways. We believe in the 4 core components. We do our method of doing this because we have found so much success with it, but there are many people that have adapted it to other ways. So explore that idea and see if it's going to work for your organization. And Rebecca, do you have any thoughts about participatory action research?
Yeah, so there's a lot of similarities between ripple effects mapping and PAR. And so participatory action research that I've always been familiar with has kind of been focused in the health arena. And so I don't know if that's the case here, if you're using it more broadly, but kind of the similar principles in which the idea that those who are part of the thing occurring, the participants should be at the center of everything. And that's the same idea that we have put forth with ripple effects mapping. And so there are quite a lot of overlap and similarities to those for sure. Ripple effects mapping, the slight difference is that we make use of this mapping process. And that's where the name ripple effects mapping came from. And so you would certainly be able to take and apply the principles that are part of participatory action research and use ripple effects mapping to collect the data. As Debra said, it's kind of one tool to make use of. And so if it makes sense for you to use this as your part of your PAR, then I would encourage that. And I would say it would seamlessly blend in, or there's other ways that might be more appropriate. Again, know your audience and know the type of data that you're looking to collect. We've left a couple minutes for some more questions. And so I think Debra's been kind of following along in the chat since I haven't been able to do so. And so I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in with anything more questions that they might have had.
Well, while people are thinking, I will loop back to one that came early on, is how do you determine the participants that attend the ripple effects mapping? And it's very difficult to have a one answer fits all, because it depends on the size of your organization or the types of reasons that you're pulling it together. We have found with this method, both online and face-to-face, 10 to 12 is a good number to look at, only because of story fatigue and mapping fatigue and group dynamics. But if you have a group that's 60 people, you might do 3 different ripple effects. I did one with that coalition with both the food pantry managers, the board of directors and the staff and volunteers separately, and then looked at where did they see the organization in similar ways, excuse me, and where did they see it in different ways. So we've adapted our tool for many different sizes and groups as well. I have so many stories that I would love to share if we had more time about the way people feel about this data. My most recent favorite is a group of people that were looking at free Narcan machines in a community to distribute Narcan. And we had addicts, current addicts, recovering addicts, and addict coaches there telling their really emotional stories. And at the end, when I was cleaning up, and there were judges and funders in the back of the room as well, they were very open about sharing their stories because it was their stories and we weren't trying to judge them or make any determination. And they, at the end, took photos and said, this is our work. They posted on Facebook. I mean, they feel joy about their stories because we feel joy about their stories. Did anybody have any last thoughts or questions? I'll go ahead and put my email in here if anybody has anything that they come up with that they need an answer for. And then I can also, I don't know if we have a link to our website. I'll put that in there. That has other resources and information. This is a free tool. We love people to use it. We love people to find applications and use it. So please take it. Any other thoughts from Becca or Sylvia as we close out?
No, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us today. And thank you to all of our attendees. We have recorded this session. We'll make sure to distribute it to everyone who registered. And our deep thanks again to Rebecca and Debra for your expertise and your time today.
Absolutely. And keep doing your good work, whatever you're doing, however you're evaluating it, keep doing your good work.
Thank you, Becca, for giving us the opportunity to come and speak to your group. We're always excited and thrilled to be able to talk about ripple effects mapping and the many ways in which it could be used. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.